I'd like to welcome everyone to the latest Metaviews Salon. These salons are really designed for our members to get to know each other, to be able to connect around their work, and for us all to learn and share ideas. I'm really excited today that we're going to talk about trustworthy artificial intelligence, which I think is a fascinating way to approach not just the technology, but the philosophy behind it, the design process, the policies, the way in which we as humans can and should be empowered by this technology rather than be put in harm's way, rather than be manipulated or ignorant of it in terms of a black box. And I'm really excited today that we have an old friend of mine, Mark Sermon, who, Mark, you're in my paths, go quite back. And I was sort of saying before we started that this is our first time taking the salon kind of onto a live stream. And the reason I felt it was appropriate to do with you is we both share a background in community media and kind of community radio, public access television. So I kind of wanted to throw to you to start on a quasi personal level of, how did you arrive? How did you get to Mozilla? How did you get to the point in which trustworthy AI is something that you're, not only actively engaged in, but I assume quite passionate about? Because as I was doing the research for this salon, I was really infected, both in the way in which you were approaching it organizationally, but also in terms of the Mark that I've always known, in terms of an intellectual, in terms of a radical thinker. So I'm curious, with that in mind, what path led you to this point, and what is it about trustworthy AI that you see as such a relevant and important opportunity?
Well, nice to see you, Jesse. That's a very auspicious introduction. Um, I have been asked that question before, like how did I get here? And my canned answer is punk rock and the peace movement. And I still feel that sort of the things that the path I started on in my teenage years that was about those things, is still the path now, and that the thing that the punk rock and the peace movement got me into, I mean, I was a teenager at the height of the kind of arms race era of the Cold War, and also the height of the 1980s peace movement that tried to push back on that. And and one of the things that was hard to do then was get the message out, and that really drew me into the idea that you know both activism needs an approach to having a voice. Is how I got into community media and grassroots filmmaking and all kinds of things. But just in general, that how communications works is such a central element to democracy and to our society being good, and all of those things. And so I've always focused on that, and that really led me, and it's where I met Jesse and many other interesting people 10, not 10, 20, 30 years ago, as the internet was starting to really shift what was possible, and it felt kind of utopian in some ways, in terms of activists being able to communicate. Um, and got into internet stuff, ran a nonprofit ISP, worked on internet policy in Canada, worked with people like Jesse on independent media and all sorts of stuff through the 90s. And whether it was in that foolishly utopian moment that we're now in part paying for, especially we see in the last week. It's not really a laughing matter, or the kind of the use of technology to control and shut people down. The questions of how does power work in the ways that we communicate, compute, connect, really are important to me. And I'm kind of an unambitious anarchist at heart still, in that I think all you can really do is disaggregate power as much as possible, in order to kind of make things reasonably good, or reasonably okay. And I think power and concentration of power in communications, and I'm sorry I missed your piece last week, Robin, but I suspect when you talked about the political economy of all this, you guys got to a bunch of that. Power aggregating too centrally is like ultimately always going to be a bad thing in communications. And so how we get to today and trustworthy AI is open source and Mozilla have always been about the idea that we want to keep much of the power of the internet distributed in as many hands as possible, and in a way that is as good for people and empowering people as possible. Yeah, so that's the backstory without getting into the current story.
Although, I mean, I wanted to ask you that partly because I know it, right? It's something that I have the knowledge of. But what blows me away about the Mozilla process is it reflects the kind of grassroots values that we sort of came up with, right? And it reflects the kind of we can have our cake and eat it too attitude of this isn't about rejecting AI, it's about rejecting the current configuration of the development of AI, right? It's not rejecting the technologies of the web, it's embracing their origins in terms of an open source and decentralized potential. And, my second question, because I admit I suffer from this too, I think there's a bit of confusion when we use the word Mozilla, what we mean, because it's sort of two entities and it's sort of one entity. I'm curious if you could describe a bit more of the relationship between the foundation and the actual entity or the software in terms of most people's experience or interface with Mozilla, and what it takes to marshal that around a goal like Trustworthy AI, and whether you feel that Trustworthy AI is more of a process than an end.
Yeah, well, this is where the things start to get used against me as well. Well, Anna, kind of give my under the hood take on sort of how to think about how do all those things connect and get marshaled and some of the frustrations. Um, in the At the very highest level, Mozilla exists, to kind of pursue the things that I talked about before. I think when we were founded as a foundation, I wasn't there then. In the actual kind of U.S. tax authority filing papers, the mission says something like, to do open source and to make a browser and whatever. But the kind of purpose for why those things was to guard the open nature of the internet. So it was a very kind of like lofty idea, and it fits to all of those things about balancing power and things that I talked about. Um, and in its first phase, Mozilla, I think, undeniably did that by it being a moment where Microsoft has sort of vacuumed in the internet. Despite sort of thinking that the web was an unimportant technology in the early '90s or the mid '90s, it came to be the monopolist in control of web browsers. 98% of web browsers by say the year 2000 were Internet Explorer, and it used that to basically take the programming languages of the web in its own direction. And so the standards that we use to make web pages and eventually to make interactive web pages like things like Facebook or Gmail, Microsoft was taking over, and most people here are, even if they're not as old as me, will remember like seeing a web page that says this web page only runs on Internet Explorer, which was Microsoft basically trying to take the languages that we use, that anybody could use to make a website, and like suck them into Windows and control their direction. And obviously that was a centralization of power of a thing that we thought that could be decentralized. And Mozilla was very good, in part because it had people who had helped invent a bunch of those languages, and in part because it had an abandoned open source browser from Netscape. It had the source code of Netscape, was able to take on Microsoft and not only create an alternative browser, and you had a pent up market of people who hated Microsoft and wanted something faster and wanted something good. And the nascent nonprofit Mozilla made that. It only had 5 staff. It was mostly volunteers. It was like, if you want to kind of imagine a fairy tale open source story, it was in many ways that. And it actually really worked on volunteer power and really did topple Goliath. And so the way I think about that moment was basically looking at like what was important about computing at the time, and like the programming language that mattered in computing was the web. It was HTML and JavaScript and CSS, and could people make things? And the wave of innovations that was the 2000s that then has led to many of the giants we have now, wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have what was called Ajax at the time, like about mixing JavaScript and XML and all those things together to make interactive of web apps. And so that change came because Firefox came in and said, hey, we're going to be a vehicle for standards. People like the browsers, developers started to use them. Microsoft had to follow suit. Google eventually followed suit with Chrome, and you kind of had an era of rich, interesting, open web stuff for a decade. And so like that's who we like to think of ourselves as Mozilla. And in that process, we happen to become financially successful because you get a few 100 million people using a piece of software. Even if you're a nonprofit, then we found a way to monetize off that, and it is mostly through Google or Yahoo or other search revenue. And so we set ourselves up as a company in the meantime, or as a social enterprise is really the way to think about it, where the nonprofit holds the software development group 100%. There's no outside investors or owners. And we originally had been a nonprofit, but just to operate as a business for tax reasons, we had to do that. And really kind of when I showed up around 2009, it was just this social enterprise operating there. But the question was, what do we want to do with the foundation, which is the core organization we set up beginning, but was no longer the operating unit. And what we've figured out over the last 10 years is really that, we have the opportunity to play not just as a social enterprise in the market, pushing things forward, but also that we kind of have in our DNA a social movement function as well, that, a lot of people mobilize around Firefox. And also the power of that is not just the mobilization to make a piece of software, but actually to influence the philosophy and the thinking and all the things that Jesse said. So we've built up the foundation in the last 10 years, really to be a little bit more like a traditional kind of philanthropy, social movement organization where we fund other people doing digital rights stuff. We publish papers like the one on Trustworthy AI. We do a lot of advocacy work and we have, I think, about 1.5 million people who are our kind of supporters who will use to kind of pressure companies to change terms of service or data that stop them from sharing data with the police, as in the case of Ring doorbells and things like that. So we now have a software arm and a kind of social movement, or let's say a market arm and a movement arm. And that's sort of who is Mozilla today. Ultimately, it's under the same governance. So the board of the foundation appoints the board of the corporation, and we try to make them work in concert. And maybe I'll pause there, but Jesse did ask, like, how do you wield the market part towards the philosophy piece of it? And so I can say more on that, but that's the answer to sort of how we're structured.
Well, and let me sort of ask, the sort of larger notion of, in the process you're at right now with Trustworthy AI, it's certainly, as you were inferring from the foundation work, you've created, I think, a really impressive intellectual ecosystem, right? A bunch of researchers, a bunch of fellows, as well as you said, kind of developers on the ground, people who are aware and mobilized and literate about these issues. And I think that in and of itself is a very impressive feat of thought leadership. While this is kind of outside of your direct responsibility, is there, on the company side, on the software development side, is there a similar response? Like, will there be products that come out of this process that integrate the philosophy, that integrate the ideas, that integrate the kind of grassroots process that's happening on the foundation side, on the, the idea side? To me, is there an opportunity, is there room for that to develop on the software side in terms of the traditional practices that Mozilla engages in?
Mm-hmm. Well, the short answer is I hope so. And I think we're going to be irrelevant and possibly fucked if we don't make that the case. But the kind of richer answer is, we stepped back a couple years ago as the foundation and said, because we do have a kind of overview piece and we also don't have the day-to-day pressures of being in the market, and so like, where can we go back to what we did 15 years ago um, and have the same kind of impact today, and what matters. And it's how we landed on the Trustworthy AI piece. And then we did talk to hundreds of people, put a lot of money behind fellows, try things out to get to the thinking that we've got today. And the reason we got to that is in the same way that the web was the programming language of 20 years ago or 15 years ago, and it was the computing paradigm of 15 years ago or 20 years ago that was structuring what the power dynamics would be. AI and data broadly cast is the computing environment and the programming language of today that's structuring how power works and who gets to do what. And so we figured if we wanted to try to play the same role we played in the past, we need to be in the focus on shaping and influencing the computing environment of today. And so that's what we picked with that in mind. Now, for very good reasons at the time, Mozilla historically, and certainly the company, and certainly Firefox, are basically data allergic. Mm-hmm. And so, the very privacy-centered focus that we've taken has been collect no data. I mean, mm-hmm. Firefox, even today, collects barely any data until a couple of years ago, really, literally compared to all of the other browsers, collected nothing, didn't have a login system, any of those kind of things. And that was for very good reasons that, let's not know anything about you. That's the best way to protect privacy. But in an era where data is the material of computing, and that it is a part of the programming language, it's not tenable. There's no influence to be had in saying, hey, we're just the best at the web stack and we're not getting anything, because like the world has moved on. And so really what Mozilla needs to do to be relevant is in part figure out like how do we play a role in both shaping the kind of the thought patterns and the policy environment and so on around this era of computing, but also how do we intervene technically, and can we build products that have some, not only relevance, but ability to shape where that goes. And so we're asking that question, but we're asking that question in an organization that still has to fight off Chrome every day in order to stay even a baseline relevant. And Google, spends as much in marketing on Chrome as we spend on engineering in Firefox. And so that, just keeping up to date on that is its own thing. And then bringing the company along, which is people who have been data allergic for 20 years, into how do we do data differently and have our cake and eat it too, as Jesse said, is a big task. And there are people, including at the leadership level, who are there, but it's not, you can't just say it and make it so. So I hope we get there. And there are things that we're doing that I think are little pieces in that, that direction. We built a new AI group inside of the company over the last year. There's some other stuff, although I think it's going to come to the foundation around ethical voice AI and kind of diversity in voice AI that we're doing. But, for now, it really is a social movement player figuring out where we go with computing today, and a software company still trying to hold the line on computing, in some ways yesterday.
Robin, did you want to jump in with a question?
Yeah, I mean, Mark, you're talking a lot about different products. What are those? I'm trying to imagine it.
Well, so different products that the company might or somebody, let's just say somebody, because there's other things we could do and are considering doing. Maybe we invest in other startups so that we're not as rich as other real venture capitalists. We could do that, or maybe we acquire things, or maybe we support other open source things. So we're working on all of those fronts in big or small ways, or kind of more mature, more nascent ways. And some of the things that I think are, where there's the most potential. So I think the area where I see the most potential is anything that shifts the paradigm around where data sits and who has control over it. And so, it's not the product layer yet, but if you think about things like data cooperatives or data trusts or data unions, where potentially I would join, um, and maybe as a product level, you could imagine that as a data locker in a simplistic sense. And then if Facebook wanted my photos, it would have to come and negotiate, not with me, but with that well-resourced data cooperative or data union. Um, that potentially is a way for people to feel like they don't have to make all the decisions every day as they move through digital life in terms of whether their concern is decisions about privacy, decisions about how their persona is monetized, decisions about how content recommendation engines are feeding them content. That if you're able to aggregate people in some kind of way, that there's an opportunity to really have the experience be different. So that's one area that I would hope that we kind of go into a product world with. It's hard to figure out where the real hook is for users to get into that. And so maybe that's not even the product layer, that's the kind of the infrastructure and the kind of legal layer. And then on top of that, it could be that you build a social network, but that's hard. Unless you have a bunch of very disenfranchised people who have been kicked off the other social networks which spewing hate, it's hard to set up your own social network. Although I think, we are going to see fragmentation in that space. Or you could set up, things that are storage tools, or backup services. And so that's a thing that we've considered. Or you could kind of enter with things like security products that then you expand. And so the one experiment we have right now is around offering VPNs, which sounds very boring, but is a kind of on-brand thing that will build us a set of relationships with people who are, security conscious and privacy conscious and so on. So there's that kind of end of what the products might be. And then I think there's another piece about looking at future communication tools. And so are there things in a world of VR or even video communication or other things that we could kind of insert ourselves inside of or create? That's a mumbling kind of answer. More important, the important and honest answer to that also is, I think it's easy and is often the case for people who sort of have a vision of the internet or anything being better, to be wandering around with a hammer looking for nails. And it's hard to figure out what are the product opportunities that are really going to take off. That's why there's a venture capital, kind of betting market, right? Is you just like bet on as many people as possible who like are going to find something that might have a hook for people. It may be that new product ideas isn't the answer. Like if you think about the success of open source, it's mostly been in product categories that were well established and then commoditized or something changed about them. So, the web browser or the web server or operating systems, all of those things which are very successful as open source, were well-established product categories before the open source versions came. And the open source versions were able to, then kind of commoditize it and make it either cheaper for people or make it more adaptable for people or often both. And so that's another thing that we need to look at is, are there categories that are ripe for shifting the way we do them, even if they may seem like quite, mundane things.
Although what I'm sort of enjoying about this discussion is we're sort of teasing out the relationship between technology and culture. And we're teasing out the idea that you sort of need both to make the dance really happen. And part of what I like about the concept of trustworthy AI is reinforces the notion of human values, but it also gets us rethinking about both the policy environment that is around it as well as the market environment around it. Because the reason I started with the whole community TV stuff is I'm using OBS right now, Open Broadcast Studio. And it blows me away that it's free and open source software that makes it really easy for anyone on the internet to start their own show and do their own thing, but it doesn't address trust. It doesn't address why you would trust all the people who are doing it on the internet. So we have this paradox now where anyone can be a TV show, even if they're storming the Capitol in DC. But it doesn't ask, should they be storming the Capitol in DC? Are they storming the Capitol because they think it would make for a great TV show? So that's why I think this notion of culture, of responsibility, of trust really reinforces what we choose to do with this technology, both in a commercial context and in a public context. So I want to use this, Sharita, as a way to throw to you in terms of, I'm curious what your thoughts are around the role that trust should play, both in terms of technology in general, but AI in specific, as a way of sort of segueing us into that sort of side of the discussion in terms of, I like the idea that trust is like a handrail, that trust is like a metric we use as part of technology, and we're kind of in the situation we're in because we've neglected it, because we haven't invested in either the social infrastructure for trust or the policy infrastructure that makes that possible.
Okay, I'll jump in. I was actually wondering and wanting to ask Mark, how come he came up with the idea, or whether you or somebody else, of the whole idea of trustworthy AI? Trust for me is a really socially loaded term. And when I often encounter the whole idea of trust online, I'm often tripping over things like security. I'm tripping over things like passwords, like, how do you make things secure? What's a secure environment? When I really look at trust, I look at it as a much more fluid and a much more social kind of idea versus a more technical idea. So I'm interested in how come you came around to the idea of trustworthy, and in reading your white paper, I looked at all the areas that you would like to touch on in terms of trust. Some of them are technical, and some of them are very social. I just want your ideas on that, the whole thing of trust.
Yeah, and that's a great set of questions and great, a whole great line of discussion. And I guess I come from the perspective, and so much so that I don't even call it out, that the social and technical are deeply intertwined. And I think while Mozilla is a very technical organization at its roots, that is also a part of a part of where it comes from. And so that's very much on purpose, or kind of the worldview we're bringing is that there's a set of social and technical pieces that are either you need both, or that they're actually inseparable and they're intertwined in certain cases. And so, I mean, if you take the just kind of bias and discrimination piece, you both have a set of normative assumptions, whether they're like the cultural background of the people who are developing the software, or normative assumptions about like how you develop software, as well as actually the materiality of the data sets and the sourcing of the data sets, which is a more technical piece. And I think you have the socio-technical aspects in so many of the challenges we look. I mean, misinformation is another one that we talk about in there, and kind of so on. And I guess to then get to the trust question. So I certainly think that trust question sits in the fact that we see these things as social, technical, and that privacy and security, which if you kind of, maybe it's actually worth backing up a little bit, is one of the things Mozilla has as a thing to stand on is a manifesto. And so, that was written partway into our life, I think like 2007 maybe. And Zillow started, depending when you count, 98 or 2003. So it sort of tried to say, okay, well, here's the things we care about. And some of them are a little social, like we want the internet to be open and accessible for all. And I guess there's a piece about the economics of the internet, which is social. But a lot of it is like feels technical. It's like open source, privacy, security, like those things that you talked about. And after 2016, and as we started to look at misinformation and just like how the internet had played a role in Brexit and Trump getting elected and all those things, it became clear that the social dimensions actually had to be a part of where we focused, that it was implicit in what we're doing. But like the oops, by being open, we screwed democracy moment was upon all of us. And we added in pieces around inclusion, around civic discourse, around truth and kind of information that's based on facts and so on, and as well as the kind of diversity and community. And so in a lot of that soul searching and kind of spending 2017 adding to some social dimensions to the manifesto, one of the things that was really clear, and this gets to your question about how we got to trust, is just how limiting and not fluid those ideas about privacy and security in particular were. And that like they made sense in a world where it was a smaller set of people on the internet, where a lot of the people who were on the internet were very motivated to solve their own technical problems and to think about what information was flowing in and out, and there wasn't that much information flowing in and out. And the idea of it in a world that is driven by data and where we're all constantly profiled and where there's actually everything that's happening dynamically around us, there's just no way to kind of possibly comprehend or track it or make all of the decisions that one would make. Privacy and security don't on their own or even primarily make sense as the ways to express that. But at the same time, there was like some deep impulse around like human agency and our kind of right to live as sane entities, and the things that you might mean as privacy before we talked about it in the internet, that was still kind of core and sacrosanct to us. And so that more fluid idea that I could trust the environment that I'm in, and to some degree trust the actors in that environment that I choose to be most intimate with, and I'm very intimate with Google or with other people who see a profile of me all the time. I want to be able to trust them in an ideal world. I think it just felt like the right term in terms of the problem we have to solve. And then you can't just or even primarily engineer that. You have to build legal frameworks around it. You need to build actual trust. You need to prove yourself and keep that trust, as well as build systems that are scrutable and that you want to rely on, which is one of the reasons that transparency for us is such a key piece of trust in this environment.
One of the contradictions when we look at trust, or when we try to work with the concept of trust, is that trust only really exists when there's an element of risk and an element of interdependence. So if you remove risks, are you then really dealing with a situation of trust? And that's something I'm always playing with in my mind as people try to regulate, as people try to make things more secure. That's always a kind of a tension that I look at when I'm looking at trust. Particularly, as I said before, my interest is online communities. So that's an idea that I'm always, trying to figure out, basically.
It's interesting, and I'm not enough of a philosopher to kind of have had that thought cross my mind about, do you need risk in order for trust to be a important concept, a relevant concept. but I would ask the question back to everybody, but including you, Sharita, like if what we're talking about is the fabric of our world that we organize through the digital, and so that includes online communities, and maybe online communities is a very, very broad concept today, and how you talk about it, I probably would talk about it pretty broadly. Is there any scenario that doesn't include risk?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there's a certain risk, even a leap of faith to the internet as a whole. And I think part of Sharita's point is we're at especially in response to the last week, in a very reactionary state of wanting to minimize, rightly so, that risk. But perhaps the paradox is, just as surveillance doesn't lead to control, even though all surveillance companies try to sell control, maybe the same notion happens with risk, that we almost have to embrace a certain level of risk in order to create the trusted spaces that we desire and take for granted. Now, Jeanette, I knew
But I
that.
think it's just impossible for it just not be there. They're just different risks that are competing. And all of the stuff in the last week is about uh, reducing the risk of insurrection, or reducing the risk of white supremacists taking over society, American society, or other society. I mean, all of those are risks I want to mitigate, or the impulse is to want to eliminate them. And even if you eliminated them, it's immediately apparent that other risks, go through the roof. And the idea that that same mitigation of that risk also shuts down Black Lives Matter activists. And so I guess I appreciate the question, but I think why we need trust is we're actually more exposed and naked. I mean, it's why the simplistic concept of privacy, I think, emerged as so central to a certain ethos of open internet people, is we are exposed and naked in this setting in order to get what we want from digital technology. Like we partly do that. I mean, especially in the era now of the amount of microphones and cameras, and then the ability to kind of work with all of that data that we all live in right now. So I think we have to figure out something about trust in that setting if we want to keep this stuff. And I don't have the answer to how to do that, but I do think we need it.
Jeanette, I wanted to bring you in at this point of the discussion, and given your mind, I don't want to pretend as if I know what you're going to say. So I'll just throw to you and allow you to jump in at this point.
I have to apologize because I feel like I'm sort of tag teaming here with Sharita. So we are not ganging up on you, Mark. But the part I wanted to address was actually the other end of the label. I don't have a problem with the trust part. The AI part is the question for me, and I'm going to just declare my biases straight up. I am skeptical of techno-utopianism as much as I want luxury space communism like every other nerd. And of course, the notion of some kind of AI that is, let's say less ambiguously a good thing is compelling. But putting my agroecologist hat on, the fact that this is a technology that is inherently reliant on an extractive process is something that I think, it puts questions there. I mean, they call it data mining for a reason, right? And sort of, in terms of natural resource extractive industries, I think we've, as a culture, kind of come to a point, I hope, where we realize these are fundamentally unsustainable. And a lot of the things that we've taken for granted that are based on that, a lot of the modern conveniences, we're now facing some hard questions about whether these are things we can continue with. And I always have that concern when I think about the entire concept of AI, is that sounds great. There's a lot of promise there. Can we even put the word trustworthy next to this, I guess, or are we just putting lipstick on a pig? Is this a kind of a form, like, is this the equivalent of saying, oh, it's eco-friendly mining, don't worry about it. Like, is that
I have some
possible?
penny stocks. I have some penny stocks and eco-friendly mining for you. No, it's a good question, and I will say, unlike Trustworthy, the choice of which came from a real evolution and a kind of a bunch of crises of confidence and sense that the words we used in the past were inadequate. And so I think the choice of the word trustworthy is very considered, and there's some cynical elements to it because other people who we wanted to align with had also started to use some similar phrasing, but it really resonated with us and fit with our kind of the journey we were on. AI is like a completely cynical choice. And the reason we chose it, though, I stand by it, and I really fought a lot of people who didn't want to have us use that as the kind of moniker, is we're trying to intervene in and shape what is the power dynamics of the current era of computing. And the thing I'll still stand by is that data and automation, which the easiest way to talk about that to people that they'll understand you quickly is to say AI, are the kind of core pieces of what's happening in computing now that are in play. And if we want different practices in those, my belief, and this is where I often am a reformist as opposed to a revolutionary in lots of debates over my life, is we have to try to shape what that paradigm of computing is going to look like, because otherwise, it's going to happen. It is happening anyways. It's built into the combination of IoT and like sensors and everything being observed and the sucking up of all of the data and processing it and using it for automation is what's happening. And so I don't see a scenario where we say like, let's just go back to static web pages, or let's go back to computing that doesn't work on data, because it's providing too much value and too much experience for people that they have become accustomed to, right? Things are automated and done for them. So my bet is we want to change that and make that more sustainable. So it's one of the reasons that my first response to Robin's question is building products based on cooperatives or unions where the data is not extractive, where the people where all of us have some say, or at least some power balance in the system of how the data is used, feel like a really central piece to shifting how things play out. But there's no question, like the people who have the most power, whether they're state actors or companies, have a deeply extractive and either greedy or sinister or both set of motivations, and that has structured what the norms are and how this era of computing is working. But I think we want to talk about switching it up, like using a term that people understand as describing what's going on right now is helpful.
Other questions, comments? Neil, you look like you're ready to jump in.
I'm ready to jump in. I've been a Firefox user, loyal Firefox user from the first moment I saw it. And the reason is because it provided me with alternatives that I thought were a lot more attractive than what I was using. And so I think what Mark can do, and I think is probably doing, is just to find a way to use AI that's more attractive or safer than what other people are doing. And then just by doing it, he will attract and tip that balance. We feel generally betrayed by Facebook because they started off with a relatively honorable or positive slogan. And then we're gradually found to be betraying us on a grand scale. We've also been told by Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking that we should fear AI. And Stephen Hawking's a lot smarter than I am, and Elon Musk is a lot richer than I am, and so they have a lot of credibility that I don't have. And so I'm willing to kind of take them at face value that they've been thinking about this a lot more than I have, and I should be very careful about AI. So if we think about, I'm not too sure that even talking about trustworthy AI isn't a bit of a naive statement. I think all tools are useful, but I don't think it's accurate to suggest that a tool is good or a tool is bad. It's effective. And then how I might choose to use that tool is more important. So if I think, for instance, about dynamite, dynamite is very effective and it can be used for great good and it can be used for great harm. And they put little tiny markers in each explosive so that it can be traced back to its origin. And that gives us a little bit of accountability as to who had this dynamite and where it came from and that kind of thing. And I think that we need to think about the term conscious. I'm using the term conscious the way that the Jamaicans, that the reggae community uses the term conscious, which is to use something for a positive social purpose. And in their case, they apply it to music. But I think in our case, we can look at it as being applied to AI. How do we use AI for a socially positive purpose? And I don't think you're going to be able to convince Facebook to do that. What you do is you provide an alternative to Facebook that most people will find attractive. And that's how you put pressure. I think that's what Firefox did for me. Firefox showed me wonderful ways of doing things that I couldn't do in any of the other browsers. And so I was very happy to move to Firefox. And I think the same thing might be applied as a paradigm with AI.
I mean, I personally think that a browser-based, privacy by default social network that doesn't depend upon data to still enable social interaction and the ability to express oneself and communicate would find a very receptive market. And that's where, to Mark's earlier point, that it's not even that Mozilla itself has to create these things. It might be funding a startup that creates these things. It might be inspiring a startup that creates these things because of the work and because of the kind of foundation that's put in from an intellectual perspective. And that's why at a very basic level, I think it's the engagement process, the discussion process that I think really has a lot of potential. And I want to sort of ask Mark a question about that. But before I do, Vas, Robin, David, Murley, do you got anything you guys would like to jump in or wade into the discussion?
I mean, I guess jumping in and just having you mention Facebook, Neil, I was thinking about what I think is actually a very good new privacy policy, the WhatsApp announcement, that's driving people away from that, I guess, platform and to others like Signal and Telegram. I see it as a public policy success, actually, and like maybe you end up nudging it from a policy perspective into the trustworthiness zone just because the disclosure is so clear. It's like if you stay on this, we're going to be sharing this type of information, across our other assets. And though it's horrifying for a lot of people and causing them to recoil, it's transparent and direct, which we haven't had before. Usually we're reading between the lines or kind of getting deep in the creep of the terms of service. So somewhat, unrelated to trustworthy AI per se, but in terms of where we're going with disclosure and the public's ability to understand, I don't know, dimensions of our black box society, I found it encouraging, though disappointing at the same time. And it remains to be seen if and when they might amend that policy and what the implications are for their business overall. That was just a thought I had, and something that was going through my mind during the chat.
It's super provocative, and I may link it back to something Neil said, and then I play with that a little bit, which is, it is, or maybe what Neil and Jesse said together, like it would be great if we get to the point, or somebody gets to the point that you just have the thing that deploys AI in a different way. And I guess it's also important to say, like, our focus is on the use of data and AI in consumer technology. Like, it's not that the AI is the product, it's the programming language. And so, I hope we can come, or others can come with products that are the products we want today that have that Firefox feeling of 15 years ago. Oh, that's different, I trusted it. So that's where we want to get. But I think a lot can happen even just, through the movement side, and it speaks to what Vas just talked about. of changing the dynamic in which the people who are building products, operate in. And we talk about two aspects of trustworthy, or just two aspects of what we're aiming for. One is, that there's more personal agency, and that gets to the question of like, do you use the tools well or not? And right now, there's not a lot of choice, whether that's that you're locked in because there's so few platforms, or whether that's you don't know why you're getting this content recommended to you, or you can go down the list of there's not in the design of most modern consumer internet services a lot of choice, or the choices you're being very directed by what kinds of choices and agency you have. And so hopefully we inspire and become some set of people who design for more agency and more choice in the way that the tools we use every day are set up. But you can design in, it's the kind of Ursula Franklin prescriptive technology, holistic technology piece in a way. We live in a prescriptive technology world. So hopefully we can build some more holistic technologies that people have more choice of how to use their tools. But the other piece that we see as part of it is an accountability piece. And it's like your piece of, your marker on the dynamite, but it also is like what's led Facebook to go and do that. It's like there was like tremendous public pressure for them to be more transparent about their privacy policies, including that Apple I wonder in the behind the scenes of Facebook what actually happened, but Apple, by requiring apps to kind of have this label about what data they collect, also I think pushed Facebook into a place of disclosing a bunch that then seemingly coincided with them being more transparent about what's in the data sharing aspects of their privacy policies, which maybe those two things are connected, or maybe they just happen to be around at the same time. But those things did actually, because of the transparency and accountability, or at least the transparency piece, which is one element of leading to accountability, I think pushed a big public reaction and the massive growth in Signal and Telegram and all those things. So one of the things that even before we get to product that we're really focused on is how you build more transparency and accountability into the system so people can make those kind of choices.
Robin, Merle?
Okay, well, maybe this is more of a self-interested question, but how do you see competition policy fitting into all of this? So you talk a lot about, the theme of power, I think, has come up a lot explicitly and implicitly, particularly like within trust. So what sort of broad policies do we need to be thinking about to ensure that we have trustworthy AI and also just, trustworthy technology overall?
Yeah, and I think, again, the AI is an ingredient in the technology, and increasingly it's a part of all technology overall. So I think your two things are very intertwined. There's at least two answers that I would kind of give to that. One is just in general, the social dominance, the economic dominance, but then certainly the dominance in AI research and just control over the direction of AI are deeply tied into the scale, like the unprecedented human scale of these enterprises, bigger than the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company and any kind of company we've ever seen in terms of the economic scale of the big American and Chinese platform companies. And because of that scale, they suck up all the data, they can build the richest profiles of us, they can all of the things. And so anything that has a meaningful impact either at the vertical or horizontal level of breaking those companies up so that there's more competition from other players, or that they control less layers of the digital economy, will lessen their control and open up more space for more others to have influence over the direction of AI and computing and how it works. And it, of course, it goes down to that. Not only do they have the data, they have so much money that if you're anybody in AI research that is serious and not incredibly principled and maybe already successful, like your academic research is paid for by Facebook or Google or Amazon. And so like the on the where does AI go? Just like breaking competition and increasing and us breaking monopolies is going to kind of help just disaggregate power and where computing goes. My pet idea that policymakers have not yet seen the incredible wisdom of, which is a little bit in the thing I mentioned earlier in the piece that Vass and I put up on CBC today, is that whether we do it through privacy and data protection regulation or through competition policy, allowing people to liberate their data from the platforms is both something that puts us in a faster and more leveraged place to have more trustworthy relationships, or at least more agentic relationships that we have control and can set the terms of. And so if there are ways, and I can imagine this is the part that policymakers aren't really talking about, that we really separate the holding of data from the provision of services based on the data, it would be a dramatic architectural change to computing and the internet today, and would be a really fast way to create competition, because then if Facebook has to come to the Canada Data Cooperative or the Robin Data Cooperative or the whatever in order to negotiate terms of service, it's easier for a competitor to come to. And it would architecturally change the dynamics of lock-ins and some aspects of network effects. So I think if we could actually separate out data control from the use of data for service provision, that could really have a big impact on a lot of the stuff we're talking about with antitrust.
Murley, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about sort of how this all, in my mind, kind of comes back to media literacy, especially for young people, because I feel like we don't have great media literacy education. I kind of feel like a lot of media literacy for people my generation and younger is self-taught in a way, and that you don't really, like, for instance, I think of sort of my little brothers who are 6 watching YouTube, and then the way that extremist content, it can be kind of promoted through those algorithms. And they may not sort of realize that, they may not process that, and then they'll get burned, right? And I'm wondering, like, how the education side ties into this, because I think these things are all very relevant and important to young people, with the trustworthy AI and sort of understanding these larger systems that we're so used to having, because of their convenience, but also just sort of communicating why it matters to younger people. Because I think, having grown up with these technologies, we take them for granted, and we're not really considering the cost, because they've always been free, and there isn't that connection between, my data is being collected, and that's maybe something I don't want. It sort of comes back to what you're saying about how it's hard to comprehend this dynamic environment that we sort of exist in. But yeah, just I'm sort of curious how, like, what your thoughts are on how media literacy applies to this, and how young people might become more aware of this kind of context.
Yeah, hopefully aware and engaged, but it's a great question. It's a tricky question. I 100% agree that media literacy, digital literacy, however you want to think about today's media literacies, is a critical piece of it. And there's we used to do a lot on digital literacy stuff, and in the end we stepped out of it just because we weren't the best people to be delivering education, but we thought a lot about it. And I think there's also in thinking about that, the kind of different layers of it. So there's a kind of a it's not just self-protective, but like a kind of read layer. So like if you think about your 6-year-old brothers, I think about it as like a big gap in just people having the kind of bullshit detection or crap detection kind of skills, or understanding what's what. And how we tackle that, like maybe is through schools, and maybe is through parents, but I think we have to have some new and more radical ideas, or just maybe some new norm setting in terms of how people think about that stuff. When I think about, and then I think about like, in whose interest is it to address that aspect, that layer of the media literacy problem? Is not YouTube's interest, right? Because they want kids to keep watching. But you think about like how we've evolved software and digital platforms. Like, when was the last time anybody on this call, used a book that was like a computer manual, like a software manual? Like Merly, maybe you never have. Like, there haven't been software manuals for like ever. And part of the reason is like we actually have developed norms in software that teach people how to use that software. Like the conventions are very well established. Like, could we, have companies that were responsible enough, or regulations that force responsibility to actually help people gain digital literacy, like as they're using the software? Or could we build a layer on top of it, like as an activist project that pushes that? So I think that's one thing, is like, I think reaching young people probably happens in great part like by intervening in the thing itself, whether that's mandated, whether that was somebody responsible, whether that's a hack. But I think there's one piece like that. And then I think there is another layer, which is maybe more what you're talking about, Neil, in terms of consciousness, and more the bigger thing you're talking about, Merly, in terms of like being able to shape the technology or critique the technology, understand why the privacy, like you don't need to know why trustworthy AI or privacy or anything matters in order to like know that that's a nasty piece of bullshit content on YouTube. And so I think that higher level of consciousness piece is much tougher. Like I don't know, I spent a lot of time thinking about it, and there's some ways of tying it to events like the last week or so on, but it's tough to get people there on anything, climate change or where the internet's going or anything.
David, did you want to take us out?
Well, I have a whole list of queries that I've made as a result of a wonderful talk, Mark. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us. The notes that I made had to do with the things that had been spoken about, the issue of trust and how you define it, and what is it, and whether you need it, and whether AI can give it, and then the nature of AI, and whether I was thinking about Jeanette's comments about the mining language and the scraping language and the sucking language of AI, and I'm wondering, is there something there that we need to think about a little more? And then I was thinking about power, and your ideas about disaggregating power, and your idea of your reference to an earlier time when we were much more foolishly utopian. I'm wondering, to what extent we understand the nature of the power that we exercise, and is there greater strength in understanding that more completely? But anyway, that was super. Thanks so much. And Jesse, Metaviews, thanks so much for putting this together.
Our pleasure. And Sumit, I noticed your camera came on just at the end. Am I going to interpret that you also wanted to squeeze in before we close?
No, I've been a silent listener because of my network connection today. I just wanted to acknowledge that what I heard was fantastic, and thanks to Mark and everyone else for some fantastic discussions.
Right on.
Appreciate that.
Well, and thanks to Stro, who's in the Twitch chat, really philosophizing on the role of VR as a way of allowing us to browse the world while still remaining connected in our physical bodies. Perhaps a subject for a future salon. And our friend Mike Gifford is typing in the chat, which in theory, viewers at home could pause the video and look at the chat right now and be able to catch up on Mike's comments. But with that said, Mark, is there any final comments you'd like to make before we close today's session?
Well, I want to say thanks as well to everybody. It's really the way we've gotten to any of this thinking and the way that it turns into anything is through conversations like this. And so I'm just like super grateful for the generosity and the thoughts and the probes and the questions and the pushback. I mean, it is a part of figuring out where we want to go with all this. And certainly the deck is stacked against us in terms of the current era of power, authoritarianism, polarized economics, and the way that the internet and computing has gone, probably unsurprisingly, is in the wrong direction. And so, anything we can do to be having conversations about pushing it in a right direction, I still think that's worth trying to do. And so I'm just grateful for the engagement on that.
Right on. Well, thank you, all of you, as always. This has been really another great session in terms of, I think, an opportunity for all of us to really wrap our heads around these ideas. I just yesterday sort of came up with a summary of what Metaviews is, and that it's an APT, an active persistent thread, in that we're constantly pulling that thread and trying to understand our world, and at the same time, the thread never ends. So join us next week when we'll have another salon on an equally interesting subject that will probably resurface some of the similar topics, but hopefully in a way that shows our progression in trying to understand their relation to each other and their relation to the world as a whole. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye for now.